The white lion cub was sitting in the middle of the dirt road, not moving, just staring at Jabari with eyes that seemed to glow in the dawn light. At first, Jabari thought the cub was dead, just another casualty of the harsh Kalahari desert where he lived. But then the cub moved, lifting one tiny white paw, and made a sound that was barely a whisper. A plea. A cry for help. Jabari froze 20 meters away, his hand instinctively gripping the walking stick he always carried. He was a San Bushman, one of the oldest indigenous groups in southern Africa, and he'd lived in the Kalahari for all of his 47 years. He'd encountered lions before, many times. He knew their power, their unpredictability, their absolute dominance of this landscape. But he'd never seen a white lion. Not in person. He'd heard the legends. His grandmother used to tell stories about the ghost lions that appeared once in a generation, lions so rare and so sacred that seeing one was considered a message from the ancestors. White lions weren't albinos. They were leucistic, a genetic rarity that turned their golden fur to cream or pure white. There were maybe 13 of them left in the wild across all of Africa. Seeing one was like witnessing a miracle. But this miracle was dying. The cub couldn't have been more than 6 weeks old. His white fur was matted with dirt and blood. His ribs showed clearly beneath his skin. His blue-gray eyes, another mark of leucism, were clouded with dehydration and exhaustion. Jabari scanned the surrounding bush, looking for the mother, for the pride, for any sign of other lions. White cubs were incredibly vulnerable. Their pale coloring made them stand out to predators and prey alike. Most didn't survive to adulthood. The mothers knew this and guarded white cubs even more fiercely than normal ones. For this cub to be alone, abandoned on a road in the middle of nowhere, meant something catastrophic had happened. Jabari stood perfectly still for 20 minutes, watching, waiting. No mother appeared. No pride emerged from the scrub. Just this one tiny cub, sitting in the road, too weak to even stand, making soft sounds that broke Jabari's heart. He knew the rules. Touch nothing. Interfere with nothing. Let nature take its course. The conservation officers who patrolled this area had made it very clear. Indigenous peoples were allowed to live here, but they couldn't interact with the wildlife. That was for the professionals. But Jabari also knew that the nearest conservation office was 2 days' drive away. By the time anyone arrived, this cub would be dead from dehydration, or killed by jackals, or carried off by eagles. And there was something else, something Jabari couldn't quite explain. The way the cub was looking at him. Not with fear. Not with aggression. But with trust. With hope. As if the cub somehow knew that Jabari was his only chance. Jabari's grandmother's voice echoed in his mind, speaking in the San language. When the ancestors send you a message, you don't ignore it. You don't question it. You honor it. Jabari took a step forward. The cub didn't move. Another step. The cub's eyes tracked him but showed no fear. When Jabari was close enough to touch the cub, he knelt down slowly and extended his hand. The cub leaned forward and pressed his small head into Jabari's palm. In that moment, Jabari knew his life had just changed forever. He didn't know how or why, but he knew with absolute certainty that this white lion had been placed in his path for a reason. He scooped the cub into his arms. The little body weighed almost nothing, far too light for a 6-week-old lion, and began the long walk back to his village, carrying in his hands one of the rarest creatures on Earth. And so began a journey that would amaze wildlife experts, challenge everything conservationists thought they knew about lions, and prove that sometimes the bond between human and animal transcends every rule we think exists. Before we continue, make sure to hit like and subscribe. Where are you watching from? Drop your country name in the comments. Now let me tell you about the incredible journey that followed. Jabari lived in a small San community in the northern Kalahari, in Botswana near the Namibian border. His people had been hunter-gatherers for tens of thousands of years, living in perfect balance with one of the world's harshest environments. They could find water where others saw only sand. They could track animals across rock. They could survive on plants and insects that would kill anyone who didn't know their secrets. But the modern world had changed everything. The San had been pushed onto smaller and smaller territories. Their traditional hunting grounds had become nature reserves where they were no longer allowed to hunt. Many San had moved to towns, taking jobs, losing their language and culture. Jabari's community was one of the few that still lived traditionally, in small huts made from branches and grass, moving seasonally to follow water and game. They had negotiated an agreement with the government. They could stay on their ancestral land, but they had to follow conservation laws. No hunting endangered species. No interfering with wildlife. Jabari knew that carrying this white lion cub into his village would violate those laws. But he also knew he had no choice. When he arrived at the village carrying the cub, people emerged from their huts and stared in silent shock. White lions were sacred in San culture. They appeared in the oldest rock paintings, in the deepest spiritual stories. Seeing one was a sign of great change, of important events approaching. Jabari's uncle, Koba, who was the village elder and spiritual leader, came forward slowly. He looked at the cub for a long moment, then at Jabari. "You found him on the road?" Koba asked in their language. "Yes." "Alone. No mother. No pride. And he came to you?" "He didn't run. He begged me for help. I couldn't leave him." Koba nodded slowly. "The ancestors sent him to you. This is a sacred trust, Jabari. You must protect him." "But the conservation officers don't understand what this means. This cub chose you. That bond is more powerful than their laws." Koba placed his hand on Jabari's shoulder. "Save his life. The ancestors will protect you from the consequences." For the next 2 days, Jabari focused entirely on keeping the cub alive. He didn't have lion's milk, but he had goat's milk from the small herd the village kept. He warmed it carefully and fed the cub using a makeshift bottle made from a cleaned leather pouch with a small hole. At first, the cub was too weak to suckle properly. Jabari had to squeeze drops of milk into the cub's mouth, massaging his throat to encourage swallowing. The cub would take a few drops, rest, take a few more. Jabari stayed awake for 48 hours straight, feeding the cub every 2 hours, keeping him warm, checking his breathing. The cub, Jabari had started calling him Tao, which meant lion in Setswana, slept curled against Jabari's chest, his small body rising and falling with shallow breaths. On the 3rd morning, Tao's eyes were clearer. He suckled more strongly. He even tried to play, batting weakly at Jabari's fingers with his tiny paws. Jabari felt hope for the first time since finding the cub. Tao was going to survive. But surviving was only the first challenge. The bigger question loomed. What happens next? Jabari couldn't keep Tao forever. Lions were apex predators. As Tao grew, he would become dangerous, not out of malice, but out of instinct. A full-grown male lion could weigh 200 kilograms and kill a buffalo with one swipe of his paw. But Jabari also couldn't just release Tao back into the wild. White lions had almost no chance of survival in the wild. Their coloring made them visible to prey from kilometers away. They couldn't hunt effectively. Other lions sometimes killed white cubs, seeing them as genetic abnormalities. Tao needed to be with his own kind. He needed to learn to be a lion. But he also needed protection until he was strong enough to survive. Jabari realized there was only one solution. He needed to find Tao's pride. If the mother was still alive, if the pride was still intact, then maybe, just maybe, they would take Tao back. It seemed impossible. The Kalahari was vast. Lion prides moved constantly, covering hundreds of square kilometers. Jabari had no idea where Tao had come from, where his pride was, or even if they were still in the area. But Jabari's people had been tracking animals across the Kalahari for thousands of years. If anyone could find a pride of lions in the desert, it was a sand tracker. On the 4th day after finding Tao, Jabari made his decision. He would take Tao and search for his family. He would use every tracking skill his father and grandfather had taught him. He would walk as far as necessary, for as long as necessary. He would bring the white lion home. Jabari prepared for the journey carefully. He filled several water containers made from ostrich eggs, traditional sand water storage that could keep water cool for days. He packed dried meat, gathered wild melons for extra moisture, and made a sling from soft leather to carry Tao against his chest, leaving his hands free. His wife, Naledi, was worried. The desert is dangerous. And carrying a lion cub, what if you encounter other lions? What if they see you as a threat? Then the ancestors will decide my fate, Jabari replied. But I have to try. This cub was sent to me for a reason. Koba, the elder, gave Jabari his blessing and a gift, a small pouch containing sacred herbs and a piece of ostrich shell engraved with symbols of protection. The old ones will watch over you, Koba said. Trust your instincts. The land will speak to you if you listen. Jabari set out at dawn, Tao secured in the sling against his chest, the cub's white head visible just below Jabari's chin. The little lion was content, having accepted Jabari completely as his protector. The first challenge was finding the starting point. Jabari returned to the exact spot on the road where he'd found Tao. He began searching the surrounding area in widening circles, looking for signs. After 2 hours, he found them, paw prints pressed into the sand near a dried water hole. Large prints from adult lions, and smaller prints from cubs. But the tracks were at least 5 days old, already being erased by the wind. Jabari knelt and studied them carefully, reading the story written in the sand. A pride had been here, maybe 6 or 7 adults, several cubs. They'd been moving northeast, toward an area where seasonal rains sometimes created temporary water sources. But there was something else. Among the tracks were signs of a struggle, deep gouges in the earth, scattered tufts of fur, spots where the sand was disturbed in patterns that suggested fighting. Jabari looked closer and found what he'd feared, human footprints. Boot prints. Recent, maybe 3 or 4 days old. Poachers. That explained everything. The pride had been attacked by poachers, probably men trying to kill adults for their bones and skins. There was a black market for lion parts, especially for traditional medicine in Asia. In the chaos of gunfire and running, Tao had gotten separated from the pride, running in the wrong direction in his panic. The pride would have kept moving, trying to escape the danger. But a mother lion never forgot her cubs. Once the immediate threat passed, she would want to search. The question was whether the pride would let her come back, or whether they'd force her to keep moving for the safety of the group. Jabari had to reach them before they moved too far away. He began walking northeast, following the faint tracks, reading the landscape. Every few hours he would stop to feed Tao, who was growing stronger and more active each day. The cub was starting to show personality, playful, curious, surprisingly gentle. He would bat at Jabari's fingers, try to chew on the leather sling, make small growling sounds that were more cute than threatening. On the second day of tracking, Jabari found more signs. A kudu kill that had been partially eaten by lions, the carcass no more than 36 hours old. The pride was still in the area, still hunting. But Jabari also found something that made his blood run cold: fresh tire tracks. A vehicle had driven off-road here, recently. The same poachers, maybe, or different ones. Either way, it meant danger. That night, as Jabari made camp in a cluster of acacia trees, Tao began acting strangely. The cub's ears kept swiveling, listening to something Jabari couldn't hear. Tao climbed out of the sling and stood at the edge of the firelight, his small body tense, staring into the darkness. And then Jabari heard it, the sound that made every hair on his body stand up. A lion's roar, deep and resonant, coming from somewhere in the darkness. Not close, maybe a kilometer or 2 away, but unmistakable. Tao's reaction was immediate and heartbreaking. The tiny cub began crying, not the small mewing sounds he made when hungry, but loud, desperate calls. The cry of a lost cub calling for his family. He was answering the roar. He was saying, "I'm here. I'm here. Come find me." Jabari's heart pounded. This was the moment he'd been hoping for and dreading. The pride was close. But would they accept Tao back? Would they see Jabari as a threat? Would they attack? He had no way to know. All he could do was trust. Trust the ancestors, trust his instincts, trust the bond he'd built with this tiny white cub. Another roar echoed through the night, closer this time. Tao cried out again, his small voice carrying across the desert. And somewhere in the darkness, lions were moving toward them. Jabari didn't sleep that night. He kept the fire burning, kept Tao close, and waited for dawn. As the sun rose, painting the desert in shades of gold and orange, Jabari heard something that made his breath catch, the sound of heavy footsteps, multiple bodies moving through the scrub. Lions. Plural. Getting closer. Tao heard them too. The cubs started making excited chirping sounds, the noise lion cubs make when greeting family members. Jabari stood slowly, placing himself between Tao and the direction of the sounds. He didn't know what was about to happen, but he knew he'd do anything to protect this cub, even if it meant facing down a pride of wild lions. The first lioness emerged from the bush 30 meters away. She was large, powerful, her golden coat catching the early light. She stopped when she saw Jabari, her body going rigid, her eyes locked on him. Then 2 more lionesses appeared, flanking the first. Then a large male, his dark mane full and impressive. They were all staring at Jabari with predatory intensity. Behind Jabari, Tao was going wild, crying out, trying to get past Jabari's legs. The first lioness took a step forward. Her lips pulled back slightly, showing teeth. A warning. The threat. Jabari didn't move. He knew that running would trigger their chase instinct. Standing still was his only chance. The lioness took another step. Then another. She was 20 meters away now, close enough that Jabari could see the scars on her muzzle, the intelligent assessment in her eyes. And then something extraordinary happened. Tao slipped past Jabari's legs and ran toward the lioness, his tiny white body bouncing across the sand, crying out with pure joy. The lioness's entire demeanor changed instantly. The threat display vanished. Her ears came forward. She made a sound, a low, rumbling call that Jabari had never heard before. A mother calling to her baby. Tao reached the lioness and threw himself at her feet. She immediately lowered her head and began sniffing him frantically, checking him everywhere, her tongue licking his face, her massive paw gently pulling him close. The other lions approached, forming a circle around the mother and cub, aunts, siblings, cousins, all touching Tao with their noses, welcoming him back into the pride. Jabari stood perfectly still, tears streaming down his face, watching the reunion he'd walked 3 days to create. The mother lioness looked up from her cub and locked eyes with Jabari. For a long moment, human and lion stared at each other. Then she did something that Jabari would remember for the rest of his life. She stood, leaving Tao with the other lions, and walked slowly toward Jabari. Every instinct screamed at Jabari to run. But he didn't. He stood still, hands at his sides, showing no threat. The lioness stopped 3 meters away. She looked at him with those intelligent amber eyes, and Jabari felt as if she could see straight into his soul, understanding everything. The days of hand-feeding her cub, the sleepless nights, the long walk across the desert. She lowered her head in what could only be described as a bow, a gesture of respect, of acknowledgement, of gratitude. Then she turned and walked back to her pride, gathering them with low calls. The lions began moving away, back into the bush. Tao walked in the center of the group, surrounded by protective bodies, his white coat standing out like a beacon among the golden lions. Just before disappearing into the scrub, Tao looked back once at Jabari. Their eyes met across the distance. And then the cub was gone, swallowed by the pride, protected by his family, home at last. Jabari collapsed to his knees in the sand, overwhelmed by emotion. He had done it. Against all odds, against all logic, he had found Tao's pride and brought him home. The 3-day walk back to his village passed in a blur. Jabari was exhausted, sunburned, and nearly out of water by the time he staggered into the settlement. But he was also filled with a sense of peace unlike anything he'd ever experienced. His return caused immediate celebration. Koba and the other elders embraced him, calling him blessed, saying the ancestors had clearly guided his steps. But the celebration was short-lived. 2 days after Jabari's return, a conservation officer's vehicle pulled into the village. Officer Molef emerged, his face stern. I heard reports that someone from this village was walking across the desert with a white lion cub. Would you know anything about that, Jabari? Jabari's heart sank. Someone had reported him, probably tourists who'd seen him on the road. Yes, Jabari admitted. I found a dying cub and reunited him with his pride. You know that touching wildlife is illegal. You should have called us immediately. I did call, Jabari lied. I waited at that spot for 2 days. No one came. the cub would have died. Malef's expression softened slightly. That doesn't change the fact that you broke the law. Koba stepped forward. The white lion came to Jabari. It was a message from our ancestors. You don't ignore such messages. I understand your cultural beliefs, Malef said. But there are procedures. Your procedures would have killed that cub, Jabari interrupted. By the time your team arrived with your equipment and your protocols, he would have been dead. I saved his life. I found his family. I didn't keep him, I didn't harm him. I did what was right. Malef was quiet for a long moment. Then, surprisingly, he smiled. Actually, that's why I'm here. We've been tracking that pride. We know there's a white cub with them. We have camera trap photos. And we also have footage of you, walking across the Kalahari with that cub in a sling, feeding him, protecting him. He pulled out his phone and showed Jabari a photo. It was unmistakably Jabari, sitting under a tree, bottle-feeding Tao. This footage has gone viral internationally, Malef continued. Everyone wants to know who you are, how you found the pride, how you reunited them. The government is calling it the miracle of the Kalahari. He put his phone away. I'm supposed to fine you for breaking wildlife laws. But my supervisor said I should offer you something instead. We want you to work with us as a traditional knowledge consultant. We need people who understand this land and these animals the way your people do. We need trackers who can accomplish what our technology can't. Jabari stared at him in disbelief. You want to hire me? We want to learn from you. And we want to make sure that when situations like this happen again, lost cubs, injured animals, wildlife emergencies in remote areas, we have people who can respond immediately using whatever methods work. Malef extended his hand. What do you say? Jabari looked at Koba, who nodded with a knowing smile. Then he shook Malef's hand. Within 6 months, Jabari had become one of Botswana's most respected wildlife consultants. He taught conservation officers traditional tracking methods. He led successful reunifications of 3 more lost cubs, not white lions, but leopards and cheetahs. He demonstrated how sand knowledge of animal behavior often surpassed what scientific research had discovered. And every few months, he would lead small groups into the Kalahari to check on Tao's pride. The white lion was thriving. Camera traps showed him playing with other cubs, learning to hunt, growing stronger and larger. At 1 year old, he was already the size of his golden siblings, his white coat gleaming in the African sun. At 18 months, Tao made his first kill, a young springbok. The pride celebrated with him as lion families do. At 2 years old, Tao began showing the dominance behaviors that would eventually make him a pride leader. Despite his coloring making him more visible, he was learning to use the terrain, to hunt in twilight when his white coat blended with the pale sand. He was surviving, thriving, defying the odds that said white lions couldn't make it in the wild. And Jabari, watching from a respectful distance through binoculars, felt pride swell in his chest. One afternoon, as Jabari sat observing the pride, something remarkable happened. Tao, now a magnificent 2.5-year-old male, suddenly lifted his head and looked directly at Jabari's position, even though Jabari was 300 meters away and well hidden. The young lion stared for a long moment. Then he stood and began walking toward Jabari. The other lions called after him, warning sounds. But Tao ignored them. Jabari's heart pounded. He'd been told repeatedly, never approach an adult lion, never make contact, maintain distance at all times. But Tao kept coming, closing the distance, until he was 50 meters away. Close enough that Jabari could see his eyes, those same blue-gray eyes, now set in a powerful face with a growing mane. Tao sat down and looked at Jabari. Just looked. And Jabari understood. Tao remembered. Not everything, maybe. Not consciously. But somewhere in his lion memory, there was a trace of the man who'd carried him across the desert, who'd fed him when he was dying, who'd brought him home. Jabari placed his hand over his heart, the same gesture he'd made when reuniting Tao with his pride years ago. Tao stood, turned, and walked back to his family. That was the last time Jabari saw Tao up close. But camera traps continued to document his life. At 3 years old, Tao challenged another young male for dominance and won. At 4 years old, he took control of his own small pride, Two lionesses and their cubs. The white lion that everyone said couldn't survive in the wild was not just surviving. He was thriving, leading, passing on his rare genetics to a new generation. And all because a Sandman had ignored the rules, trusted his ancestors, and walked 3 days across the desert to bring a lost cub home. Scientists who studied the case were amazed. They'd assumed white lions needed human intervention to survive. But Tao proved that with the right start, with protection during the vulnerable early months, even the rarest lions could make it. Jabari's method, using traditional tracking, understanding lion family structures, trusting instinct over protocol, became a template for wildlife rescues across southern Africa. Indigenous communities that had been pushed out of conservation began being invited back in as partners. Their knowledge, once dismissed as primitive, was now recognized as invaluable. And Jabari? He continued living in his traditional village, but now he traveled regularly, teaching, consulting, sharing the wisdom his ancestors had accumulated over thousands of years. He never forgot the morning he found a dying white cub on a desert road. He never forgot the 3-day walk that changed his life. He never forgot the moment a lioness bowed to him in gratitude. Because that journey taught him something the modern world was only beginning to understand, that the oldest knowledge is often the best knowledge, that indigenous peoples don't need to be kept away from wildlife to protect it, and that sometimes the most incredible journeys begin with one simple choice: to help when everyone says you shouldn't. If this story moved you, please share it. Tell us in the comments, have you ever followed your instincts even when rules said you shouldn't? Hit like and subscribe for more stories about the incredible bonds between people and animals, and about indigenous wisdom that's finally being recognized. Because somewhere in the Kalahari, a white lion leads his pride across the desert, alive because a Sandman understood that some bonds transcend species, some journeys are guided by ancestors, and some rules need to be broken when a life hangs in the balance. Sometimes the rarest creatures teach us the most important lessons. And sometimes an incredible journey begins with one small act of compassion.